In the shadow-drenched decade of the 1970s, when America's social fabric was unraveling and trust was becoming a luxury few could afford, women began disappearing, not in the dramatic fashion of Hollywood thrillers, but quietly, methodically. Like morning mist evaporating under an indifferent sun, they vanished from beaches in California, from street corners in Seattle, from parking lots where they had stopped to help a stranger with a broken-down car. Each disappearance carried the same haunting signature: a beautiful young woman, full of life and promise, who had encountered a charming man with kind eyes and a disarming smile. The pattern was invisible at first, scattered across state lines and jurisdictions that rarely spoke to one another. Police departments filed reports, families posted missing person flyers, and communities held vigils. But the connections remained hidden in the bureaucratic maze of 1970s law enforcement. What they didn't know was that somewhere in their midst walked a predator unlike any they had encountered before. He was educated, articulate, and devastatingly handsome. He carried a camera and spoke of art, of capturing beauty in its purest form. Women trusted him instinctively, drawn to his intellectual charm and apparent sensitivity. This man moved through society like smoke through fingers, present but untouchable, visible yet somehow transparent. He understood the psychology of attraction, the delicate dance of courtship, and the precise moment when trust transforms into vulnerability. He had learned to weaponize charm itself, turning what should have been humanity's greatest gift into its most dangerous trap. Behind his photographer's lens lay eyes that saw not beauty, but opportunity, not art, but conquest, not subjects, but victims waiting to be claimed. Rodney James Alcala was born into a world that seemed designed to nurture his particular brand of darkness. Raised in a broken home, shuttled between relatives, and marked early by abandonment, he developed the emotional armor that would later allow him to navigate society as both participant and predator. By his 20s, he had transformed himself into exactly the kind of man women found irresistible: tall, dark-haired, with penetrating eyes that suggested depth and mystery. His intelligence was undeniable, his wit sharp, and his knowledge of art and culture impressive enough to captivate even the most educated companions. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never known rejection. Though those who looked closely might have noticed something unsettling in his gaze, there was a quality of assessment in his interactions, as if he were constantly calculating, measuring, determining value. He spoke multiple languages, had studied at prestigious institutions, and could discuss everything from classical music to contemporary photography with equal fluency. To casual observers, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed: a talented photographer and filmmaker pursuing his artistic vision. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lay a history of troubling incidents that should have served as warnings. There had been complaints from women who felt uncomfortable during photo shoots, reports of aggressive behavior when rejected, and a pattern of boundary violations that suggested something far more sinister than mere social awkwardness. His relationships were intense but brief, marked by an obsessive need for control that became apparent only after emotional investments had been made. Friends described him as charming but unpredictable, capable of sudden mood shifts that could transform him from delightful companion to menacing stranger in moments. Those who knew him best sensed an underlying tension, as if he were constantly performing a role rather than simply being himself. He collected identities like souvenirs, adopting different personas for different situations, always seeming to know exactly what others wanted to see. This chameleon-like quality would prove to be one of his most dangerous weapons, allowing him to approach victims with precisely the personality most likely to gain their trust and lower their defenses. The first documented glimpse into Rodney Alcala's true nature came in 1968, when an 8-year-old girl named Tali Shapiro encountered him near her elementary school in Hollywood. What transpired in his apartment that day would have been enough to lock away most predators for decades. But Alcala possessed something that would repeatedly save him from the full consequences of his actions: an almost supernatural ability to appear less dangerous than he actually was. The assault was brutal, methodical, and would have been fatal if not for the intervention of a concerned witness. who called police after seeing the child being led away by a man whose demeanor had triggered every parental alarm bell. When officers arrived at Alcala's apartment, they discovered a scene that should have ended his story before it truly began. The child was beaten beyond recognition, sexually assaulted with savage violence, and left for dead in a pool of her own blood. The responding officers would later describe it as one of the most horrific crime scenes they had encountered in their careers, but Alcala had already vanished, demonstrating the same calculated thinking that would characterize his crimes for decades. He had fled to New York, where he would reinvent himself once again, this time as a student at New York University, studying film under Roman Polanski. The irony was not lost on investigators, who would later piece together his movements. He had sought out one of cinema's most controversial figures to learn the art of visual storytelling, all while crafting his own dark narrative of violence and control. For 2 years, he lived quietly on the East Coast, attending classes, developing his photographic skills, and apparently controlling whatever urges had driven him to attack the child in California. He immersed himself in the world of avant-garde filmmaking, learning techniques of lighting, composition, and narrative structure that he would later apply to far more sinister purposes. His professors remembered him as talented but intense, someone who seemed particularly drawn to projects exploring themes of power, dominance, and psychological manipulation. But control, for men like Alcala, is always temporary and never complete. He was eventually apprehended and returned to California, where he would plead guilty to child molestation and serve less than 3 years in prison. The sentence was shockingly light, even by the standards of the era, and seemed to reinforce his belief that he could navigate the justice system as easily as he navigated social situations during his incarceration. He became a model prisoner, participating in rehabilitation programs and demonstrating what appeared to be genuine remorse for his actions. Prison counselors noted his intelligence and apparent insight into his psychological problems, recommending early release based on his exceptional progress and low risk of reoffending. Upon his release, Alcala registered as a sex offender but quickly discovered that society's monitoring systems were woefully inadequate to track someone of his intelligence and determination. He resumed his photography with renewed focus, began working at a children's arts camp, and continued to present himself as a reformed man pursuing legitimate artistic goals. The warning signs were there for anyone willing to see them, but the 1970s were a time when second chances were given freely and background checks were cursory at best. He had learned from his mistakes, but not in the way society had hoped. Instead of reforming, he had simply become more careful, more strategic, and infinitely more dangerous than before his imprisonment. By 1978, Rodney Alcala had perfected his public persona to such a degree that he could literally put his charm on display for national television audiences. His appearance on The Dating Game represents one of the most chilling intersections of entertainment and evil in American media history, sitting beneath studio lights, wearing a fashionable suit and his most disarming smile. He answered questions with wit and charisma that captivated both the show's producers and its studio audience. His responses were clever, slightly provocative, and delivered with the kind of confidence that made him seem like the perfect bachelor. What viewers at home couldn't know was that they were watching a man who had already killed, who carried with him photographs of victims in various stages of terror and death, and who saw the television appearance not as an opportunity for romance, but as another hunting ground. The woman who won the date, Cheryl Bradshaw, would later report feeling deeply uncomfortable during their brief interaction after the show, describing an inexplicable sense of danger that made her decline his invitation for their prize date. Her intuition may have saved her life. The appearance itself was masterful theater, a performance by someone who understood that the key to deception lies not in creating elaborate lies, but in presenting a version of truth that serves your purposes. Alcala spoke about his interest in photography, his love of art, and his desire for meaningful connection. Everything he said was technically accurate, but the context he provided was completely false when he mentioned enjoying quiet evenings and intimate conversations, Audience members probably imagined romantic dinners and long walks on the beach. They couldn't have conceived that his idea of intimacy involved complete psychological and physical dominance over another human being. The show aired during what investigators would later determine was one of Alcala's most active periods. He was hunting regularly, using his photography as both a lure and a trophy system, documenting his crimes with the same attention to detail he brought to his legitimate artistic pursuits. The dating game appearance served multiple purposes. It provided him with a public platform to display his charm, created an alibi that suggested normal social behavior, and fed his narcissistic need for attention and validation. For 48 minutes, he was exactly what he had always wanted to be, the center of attention, desired and admired, with no one suspecting the darkness that lay beneath his polished exterior. The true scope of Rodney Alcala's crimes began to emerge only decades after his most active period, when advances in forensic science and cold case investigations started connecting dots that had remained invisible to 1970s law enforcement. His methodology was as sophisticated as it was brutal, combining the calculated approach of a professional with the sadistic impulses of someone who derived genuine pleasure from others' suffering. He didn't simply kill, he orchestrated elaborate scenarios designed to maximize both his control and his victim's terror. Each murder was a carefully choreographed performance where he served as director, lead actor, and sole audience member for his own twisted theater of cruelty. Photography was central to his method, but not merely as a lure. While he certainly used his camera to approach women under the pretense of professional shoots or artistic collaboration, the true purpose was documentation and psychological warfare. He photographed his victims before, during, and after their ordeals, creating a personal collection that served as both trophies and reliving mechanisms. These weren't impulsive crimes of passion, but carefully planned productions that could last. For hours or even days, he would show earlier photographs to new victims, demonstrating his power and their helplessness while simultaneously documenting their terror. For future enjoyment, the camera became an instrument of torture itself, each click of the shutter marking another moment of degradation and despair. His victims were chosen with clinical precision, selected not just for their physical attractiveness, but for psychological vulnerabilities that made them ideal targets. Young women who projected confidence but harbored deep insecurities, runaways who wouldn't be missed immediately by families or institutions, college students whose disappearances might be attributed to dropping out or changing life directions, models and aspiring actresses who were hungry enough for success to ignore warning signs that might have deterred others. He studied their routines with the patience of a professional stalker, learned their weaknesses through casual conversation, and approached them at moments when their psychological defenses were naturally lowered. A flat tire that needed changing became an opportunity to display helpfulness. A modeling opportunity that seemed too good to pass up became a trap baited with ambition. A charming stranger offering assistance when they were lost or confused became their final human contact. The murders themselves followed patterns that suggested both ritual behavior and progressive escalation of violence. He used strangulation, frequently, but not always as the immediate cause of death. Sometimes it was a method of control, rendering victims unconscious so he could transport them to secondary locations, where he could take his time without fear of interruption. The torture was systematic and prolonged, designed to create maximum psychological impact while keeping victims alive as long as possible. He was particularly drawn to the moment when hope transformed into despair, when his victims realized that their charm, intelligence, or negotiation skills would not save them from their fate. This psychological breaking point seemed to provide him with satisfaction that transcended mere sexual gratification, suggesting a level of sadism that went beyond typical predatory behavior into something approaching an artistic expression of pure evil. He would often revive unconscious victims multiple times, not out of mercy, but to extend their suffering and his own enjoyment of their terror. For decades, Rodney Alcala's crimes existed as separate tragedies scattered across multiple jurisdictions, each investigated in isolation by departments that had no reason to suspect connections. to similar cases hundreds of miles away. The fragmented nature of American law enforcement in the 1970s and 1980s had created perfect conditions for a predator of his sophistication to operate undetected. Local police departments worked their cases with dedication, but without the technological infrastructure or interagency communication systems necessary to identify patterns that crossed state lines. Alcala had essentially weaponized bureaucracy itself, using jurisdictional boundaries and communication gaps as camouflage for what was actually a highly organized, multi-state campaign of violence. The breakthrough that would finally expose the full scope of his predation came not from brilliant detective work, but from the mundane necessities of modern life, storage unit auctions, and digital photography enhancement techniques that hadn't existed during his most active period. In 2010, Seattle police were investigating the 1979 murder of Robin Samso, a 12-year-old girl whose death had remained connected to Alcala through witness testimony, but had never been definitively proven. During their investigation, they discovered that Alcala had maintained storage units in multiple states, facilities where he had kept his most precious possessions during periods of incarceration and relocation. When investigators finally gained access to these storage units, they discovered a treasure trove of evidence that had been sitting in climate-controlled darkness for decades. Hundreds upon hundreds of photographs, many featuring unidentified women and children in various states of undress and apparent distress, provided law enforcement with the first comprehensive look at Alcala's documentation system. The images were haunting not just for their content, but for their technical quality and systematic organization. These weren't hasty snapshots taken by someone losing control. They were carefully composed photographs taken by someone who saw his crimes as worthy of professional-grade documentation and preservation. Advanced DNA technology had revolutionized forensic science to the point where investigators could extract usable genetic material from evidence that had been considered too degraded to process in earlier decades. Microscopic samples of blood, saliva, and other biological material that had been collected at crime scenes throughout the 1970s and 1980s suddenly became viable sources of identification. Cold cases across California, New York, Washington, and Wyoming began yielding matches to biological samples that connected directly to Alcala's genetic profile. Each DNA match created another connection in what was becoming a vast web of violence that stretched across the continent and spanned more than a decade of active predation. The investigation revealed a level of mobility and strategic planning that had made Alcala nearly impossible to track using traditional methods available to investigators in previous decades. He had traveled constantly, sometimes committing crimes in different states within days of each other, using a sophisticated understanding of law enforcement limitations. To stay ahead of any potential investigation, his victims had been chosen from widely different demographics and geographical areas, making pattern recognition extremely difficult for investigators who were working with limited communication systems and no computer databases capable of cross-referencing crimes across multiple jurisdictions. Perhaps most disturbing was the gradual realization that the recovered photographs likely represented only a fraction of his actual crimes. Many of the women and children in the images remained unidentified despite extensive publicity campaigns, database searches, and collaboration with missing persons organizations across the country. The haunting question facing investigators was not just how many people Alcala had killed, but how many more victims might still be buried in locations known only to him. Their disappearance is never properly investigated or connected to the charming photographer who had offered to make them famous. The legal proceedings against Rodney Alcala became a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation as he chose to represent himself in court, transforming his trial into a final performance where he could once again be the center of attention. This decision, while legally permissible, created the surreal and deeply disturbing spectacle of a serial killer cross-examining survivors of his attacks and family members of his victims. His courtroom behavior revealed the same calculating intelligence that had made him successful as a predator, but also exposed the grandiose self-image and complete lack of empathy that had driven his decades-long killing spree. Acting as his own attorney, Alcala demonstrated an intimate knowledge of legal procedures and evidence rules that he had clearly studied extensively during his years in prison. He challenged forensic evidence with sophisticated arguments that revealed a thorough understanding of DNA analysis, questioned witnesses with the tactical precision of an experienced litigator, and presented alternative theories with enough plausibility to create reasonable doubt in some observers' minds. His opening statement was delivered with the same charm and confidence that had made him successful on the dating game, as he positioned himself as a victim of circumstantial evidence and prosecutorial overreach. But his performance also revealed deeply disturbing aspects of his psychology that no amount of legal maneuvering could disguise. The prosecution's case was built on an overwhelming combination of DNA evidence, photographic documentation, and testimony from the few survivors who had managed to escape his attacks. The photographs recovered from his storage units proved particularly damaging, as many depicted victims in situations and locations that could only have been created by their killer. Expert witnesses testified about the progression of violence visible in the images, describing a systematic approach to torture and murder that spoke to extensive planning, complete absence of empathy, and a level of sadistic enjoyment that went far beyond typical criminal behavior. The forensic evidence was devastating in its completeness, linking Alcala definitively to crime scenes across multiple states and spanning several decades. Perhaps most chilling were the moments when Alcala's carefully constructed mask slipped during the proceedings. While cross-examining a survivor who had managed to escape from his car after being brutally beaten, he became visibly agitated when she described his behavior as creepy and predatory. His response revealed not remorse, embarrassment, or even strategic concern about how his reaction might appear to the jury, but genuine anger at being characterized in unflattering terms. He seemed more concerned with protecting his self-image than with the devastating pain he had caused, treating the trial as an opportunity to rehabilitate his public reputation rather than as a legal R. Reckoning for his crimes, his questions to family members of victims showed a complete inability to comprehend the depth of their loss, as he focused on technical details and timeline discrepancies while remaining utterly indifferent to their emotional testimony. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts of first-degree murder. With special circumstances, the evidence had been so overwhelming and Alcala's own behavior so revealing that there was little doubt about his guilt. The judge sentenced him to death, noting that the crimes showed a level of depravity and premeditation that demanded the ultimate punishment available under California law. But even in defeat, Alcala maintained his performance until the very end, showing no visible emotion as the sentence was read and continuing to insist on his innocence in subsequent media interviews. His final courtroom performance was perhaps his most convincing yet. The role of a wrongly convicted intellectual facing execution with dignity and grace, a man more sinned against than sinning. It was a testament to his manipulative abilities that even some observers found themselves momentarily questioning whether such a charming, articulate individual could truly be capable of the monstrous crimes for which he had been convicted. In the end, Rodney Alcala died in prison in July 2021, taking with him secrets that may never be fully uncovered. Investigators believe he may have been responsible for as many as 130 murders across multiple decades, making him potentially one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Yet even this staggering number may represent only a fraction of his actual victims, as his sophisticated methods, constant mobility, and the technological limitations of the era made comprehensive investigation nearly impossible. The hundreds of unidentified photographs found in his possession serve as haunting reminders of lives that were ended and stories that will never be told. Faces frozen in time that represent someone's daughter, sister, friend, or lover whose fate remains unknown. The case exposed fundamental weaknesses in how America tracked and prosecuted violent criminals during the latter half of the 20th century. revelations that led to significant reforms in interagency communication and information sharing. Alcala's ability to move freely between jurisdictions, to reinvent himself repeatedly with minimal background checks, and to exploit gaps in communication between law enforcement agencies revealed a criminal justice infrastructure that was woefully unprepared to deal with predators of his sophistication and geographic scope. His success wasn't just due to his intelligence and manipulative charm, but to a fragmented system that was designed for a simpler time, when criminals typically operated within small geographical areas and left behind evidence that could be processed with available technology. The psychological profile that emerged from decades of investigation revealed a killer whose motivations went far beyond the typical explanations offered for serial murder. This wasn't simply about sexual gratification, power, or even sadistic pleasure, though all those elements were present. Alcala appeared to be driven by a complex need to create and star in his own narratives of dominance, to transform real human beings into characters in elaborate productions where he controlled every aspect of the story from beginning to end. His photography wasn't just documentation. It was artistic expression of the darkest impulses imaginable, a body of work that represented the complete commodification of human suffering. For personal satisfaction, perhaps most disturbing is the realization that Alcala operated in plain sight for decades, not just hiding among normal society, but being actively celebrated by it. His dating game appearance has become a symbol of how effectively evil can disguise itself. But the reality extends far beyond that single television moment. He wasn't just hiding among us. He was being hired for jobs, trusted with children, admired for his artistic talents, and chosen by women who saw in him exactly what they were looking for in a romantic partner. His success as a predator relied not on stealth or concealment, but on society's willingness to see what it wanted to see and ignore warning signs that, in retrospect, seem almost impossibly obvious. The families of his confirmed victims continue to seek closure, knowing that somewhere in abandoned storage units, unmarked graves, or forgotten crime scenes, evidence of their loved ones' final moments may still exist. The photographs that launched the modern investigation remain a source of both hope and torment, as each unidentified face represents a family that never received answers, a missing person case that was never properly investigated, or a disappearance that was attributed to voluntary departure rather than violent crime. Law enforcement agencies across the country continue to receive calls from families who recognize faces in the photographs, leading to new investigations and occasionally to the heartbreaking confirmation of long-held fears. Rodney Alcala's legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, intuition, and the nature of evil itself. His story reminds us that monsters don't always look like monsters, that intelligence and charm can be weaponized as effectively as any physical tool, and that our social systems designed to give people second chances can be exploited by those who view mercy as weakness. The question that haunts investigators, victims' families, and society at large is not just how many victims he claimed, but how many others like him are still out there, hiding behind smiles and cameras and carefully constructed personas, waiting for their next opportunity to turn human trust into unspeakable tragedy.